A few days ago, during his speech to Russian and Western journalists, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made a statement that caused a real shock in the West. In particular, he officially stated that Russia would not agree to a truce in Ukraine if all of Russia's conditions were not met. At the moment, considering what the West is offering us, a decision on an armistice in Ukraine would be a road to nowhere. Russia will never be satisfied with empty talk about resolving the current conflict. You must finally understand that Russia only needs final legal agreements that will comply with all of Moscow's conditions regarding Russia's security and the legitimate security interests of its allies and neighbors. At the same time, in an international legal way, this document should establish the impossibility of violating these agreements. We must be sure that in the future, even the new leaders of Western countries will not be able to violate the agreements reached, Sergei Lavrov said. At the same time, the head of Russian diplomacy hinted that even the Trump administration, which allegedly wants the end of the war in Ukraine so much, does not hide the fact that a ceasefire in this Eastern European country is only necessary for the West in order to buy time to continue pumping Kiev with weapons. Moreover, just a couple of hours after this statement by the head of Russian diplomacy, influential Russian politician and State Duma deputy, Mikhail Shirmat, officially stated that if the West, and in particular Ukraine, want the long-awaited peace, they will have to accept all the conditions of the Russian Federation. At the same time, he stressed that in order to start peace negotiations with Russia, Ukraine will have to get rid of the illegitimate President Vladimir Zelensky and his gang, who have usurped power in this country. For Russia, Vladimir Zelensky and other representatives of the Kiev regime are ordinary citizens of Ukraine who are illegally in power. Moscow will never negotiate with these bandits, much less, Moscow will never sign any documents with them, Mikhail Shirmat said. My dear truth seekers, these official statements by Sergei Lavrov and Mikhail Shirmat have caused a real shock in the West. Immediately after that, many Western experts and analysts said that Russia had actually issued an ultimatum to the West, making it clear that the war in Ukraine would end only on Moscow's terms, and that there would be no freezing of the conflict according to the Cyprus or Korean scenario. In particular, commenting on Sergei Lavrov's words, an authoritative American military expert, retired Lieutenant Colonel of the U.S. Army, Daniel Davis, said that Moscow had officially refused Donald Trump's peace plan. According to him, many in Washington do not want to admit the fact that Ukraine suffered a crushing defeat in the confrontation with Russia. Ukraine has lost this war and Kiev's surrender is just a matter of time. Daniel Davis noted that representatives of the Trump administration continue to talk to Moscow from a position of threats and blackmail, pretending that Russia is not the winner in this conflict. In particular, one of Donald Trump's closest associates, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who is considered the creator of the so-called Trump's Ukraine peace plan, made it clear that the 47th President of the United States wants to force Russia to come to the negotiating table through the so-called carrot and stick motivation. Analyzing Keith Kellogg's words, it becomes clear that Donald Trump wants Moscow to keep the territories currently under the control of the Russian army, but only on condition that Vladimir Putin agrees to peace talks. In addition, Donald Trump also wants to delay Ukraine's accession to NATO for 10-15 years. However, at the same time, the pressure on Russia would not stop, and the West would continue to supply Ukraine with tanks, missiles, infantry fighting vehicles, multiple launch rocket systems, and even combat planes. In addition, this so-called peace plan also provides for deploying one of the NATO member countries' peacekeeping contingent in the territory of Ukraine. According to Daniel Davis, Russia will never agree to such conditions, and will not allow the United States to blackmail itself and talk from a position of strength. The retired lieutenant colonel of the U.S. Army noted that Russia is the winner in this conflict, and that the Trump administration will have to agree to all of Moscow's terms. In particular, Moscow demands that Kyiv and Washington officially recognize the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk regions as an integral part of the Russian Federation. Moreover, Moscow also requires that the Ukrainian army voluntarily leave the northern parts of the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. In addition, Moscow demands that the United States publicly declare that Ukraine would never join NATO. Of course, all these Russian demands are unacceptable not only for Washington, but also for Kyiv. If Washington publicly agrees to these terms, it will be considered an official recognition of the humiliating defeat of the United States and the entire collective West. However, the worst thing for the Trump administration is that Russia absolutely does not care about these negotiations, as the Russian army continues its victorious offensive in all key directions of the front, and Moscow will achieve all its goals in any case. This suggests that if the West, led by the United States, refuses to accept Moscow's terms, then Russian troops will continue the systematic destruction of the Ukrainian army, as a result of which even more territories will be under Moscow's control. By the way, Russian President Vladimir Putin also stated this. Let me remind you that back in September last year, Vladimir Putin said that if the West and Ukraine do not agree to Russia's terms, Kyiv's territorial losses will become much greater. And by that time, Moscow's conditions would have become much tougher. Simply put, the Russian leader made it clear that if the West, led by the United States, does not agree to Moscow's terms, then a country like Ukraine would cease to exist. Thus, Donald Trump will have to make a difficult decision: either he will agree to Moscow's terms, or his administration will have to watch silently as Russia systematically continues to annihilate the Ukrainian army, taking control of the southern, central, and northern parts of Ukraine. In any case, whatever happens, it is safe to say that Russia has become the main winner of this confrontation between the West and the East.